Hello and welcome. So, today we're going to be speaking about human memory from a cognitive science point of view.
When he died, I remember thinking it was like the sun had gone down. It was never going to rise again. I walked in the dark for so long. I can't let him go. I never understood why people said that. If you love someone, why would you ever let them go? That's what saved me. The only part of Charlie I had left was his memory. And if I died, the darkness would take that too. But if I kept moving, I could fight the light again. And I could bring him with me.
This beautiful scene from Westworld, a TV show produced by HBO, demonstrates how important memory can be for people in our lives. But it also raises an important question from a cognitive science point of view, which is why is some information maintained in memory while other things are forgotten? So, by the end of this video, I hope you'll be able to make a reasoned argument to answer this question. And you'll also be able to describe the various types of memory and their timescales, and those are our intended learning outcomes for today. So, what is memory? Well, from a cognitive science point of view, memory is the capacity to encode, store, and retrieve information after it has initially been encountered. So let's dig in a little bit more to those different aspects of memory. Encoding is essentially sending information into storage, which then can be used in the future. Storage is just maintaining that information over time. And retrieval is when you recall previously encoded information from storage. And this is the type of memory that we test when, for example, we do a fill in the blanks type of assessment. So, what do you think the purpose of human memory is? Maybe just take a few seconds to consider that. Well, I think that there are many possible answers, but I thought this is quite an interesting one from Stanislas Dehaene, who is a wonderful cognitive neuroscientist in France. He said, we've been wrong about memory. It's not a system which is oriented towards the past, but one whose role is to send data to the future so we may later access it. So, from this point of view, the brain must estimate which information could be useful in the future and then send only that to the storage. And this act of sending information from a temporary, shorter memory state to a longer term store, that's what's called encoding. So now we're going to take a step through different types of memory, and we're going to go from very brief types of memory to much longer scales. And the first we're going to look at is called sensory memory, and this only lasts for less than a second. We're talking about tens or hundreds of milliseconds. And in the visual system, this is known as iconic memory. And I'm going to show you a video from the Netherlands Institute of Neuroscience talking about Peter Rolfsema's work in this area.
Take a look at the fixation point. We'll show you 12 letters and digits. Try to remember as many as you can. Ready? If you're like most people, you probably remembered about 4 or 33%. Now let's make it easier. Next, you'll only need to remember one row indicated by a tone. A high tone for the highest row, a medium tone for the middle row, and a low tone for the lowest row. Ready? Hopefully, this was easier because you heard the tone before you saw the stimulus. But what if we present the tone after the stimulus has disappeared? Ready? Most people are able to now recall the entire row, even if the tone is presented after the stimulus. This is possible because the stimulus is stored in iconic memory, which is an almost photographic, but very short-lived form of memory.
One of the areas we might encounter sensory memory is if we have a sparkler, which is a type of tiny little firework that kids sometimes use around Halloween here. And sometimes if you swing it very quickly in the air, after the sparkler has passed, you can still see a kind of a very brief memory of where the sparkler has passed. And people sometimes use this to draw letters. But what happens after sensory memory? Well, after sensory memory, some of that information will be pushed into working memory or short-term memory. And this is a type of memory system that lasts for seconds, up to tens of seconds, but usually no longer than a minute. So working memory is really an explicit type of memory, which is conscious. It's what's on your mind in the moment and for a few seconds after a stimulus has passed. One example might be if you're asked to remember a one-time code, for example, to access a website. We can play this now, so please try to remember this one-time code. But don't remember this other code or this. So, what was the one-time code? So working memory is a short-term system that is explicit and conscious and is able to hold on to information and sometimes manipulate that information even in the presence of distractors. There is also another type of short-term memory that is implicit or unconscious, and this can also last for a few seconds, but it seems to be limited in terms of what you can do with that information. So here we see, for example, an experimental setup designed to uncover this type of memory. In this task, human participants are asked to look at a dot, a fixation spot in the middle of the screen. Then a stimulus is flashed on very quickly, just for 17 milliseconds. After a very short gap, a mask is shown that covers the location and other locations on the screen. Then there's a delay, and after a couple of seconds, the participants have to respond by saying the letter to say which of the locations corresponded to the target location. They have to do that whether or not they actually consciously perceived the target location, and at the very end they have to say if they saw or perceived the target or not. So here is the angular error of their response, and when they clearly see the target, they do exceptionally well with very little error. And you also see very good responses for when they just see the target weakly or just glimpse it. They still do very well. But what is not as intuitive for many of us is that even when participants say that they definitely did not see anything there, but they are forced to guess as to the target location, they still select the correct location much more often than chance. So this suggests that there is an unconscious or implicit type of short-term memory. Now we separate this short-term and working memory because it seems that for this unconscious short-term memory, you're not actually able to do much manipulation or mental calculations with the contents of the memory. Some contents of working memory or short-term memory will be encoded further into long-term memory. And long-term memory can last from days to years to even decades or a whole lifetime. Okay, so now please pause the video and answer this quiz question on Blackboard. So now we're going to talk about types of long-term memory. So long-term memory can also be divided into explicit or conscious parts, which include episodic memory and semantic memory, and implicit or unconscious parts, which include procedural memory. So episodic memory is when you remember individual episodes, and this can include episodes of your own life. So for example, what's your first memory of being outside your hometown or your home country? Semantic memory is more general knowledge. So for example, what's the population of Bristol? So you might know that, but you might not necessarily remember the event where you learned the population of Bristol. But these types of knowledge tend to be recalled explicitly and consciously. But there's also an unconscious or implicit type of long-term memory, and this is called procedural memory. And these are often skills that we learn, sometimes motor skills, that we learn to a very high standard, but we don't have to consciously recall to memory exactly how to do them every time. So an example might be if you enter a password on a frequently used device, often you can do that automatically without really realizing it. In fact, sometimes if you try to consciously think of what your password is, it can make the task more difficult. Another example of procedural memory is the skills of riding a bicycle. You know something is likely to be a procedural memory or a habit or a skill if you can do it to a high standard while consciously thinking of something else. So to recap today's lesson, memory can be divided into several different categories. We can divide it by time scale, for example, into sensory, short-term or working memory, and long-term memory. We can divide it according to the involvement of consciousness when we recall the memory into explicit or implicit memory, and by the amount of generalization from the original experience. So episodic memories tend to focus really on reconstructing the content of the original memory, whereas semantic memories generalize from those original events to try and understand something more general about the world. We also heard an interesting perspective that memory may be thought not as a past-oriented function, but as a future-oriented function, so that the brain, at the point of choosing which information to encode, may think, which information should I make available to the future? Next up, we're going to cover how we learn from a cognitive science point of view. Now, if you're still curious and you want to learn more, here are some excellent references and a touching video of Clive Wearin at the end.